Relocated. If you like dark stories that governments tried to bury, smash the like button like you're deleting evidence, subscribe like you're hiding from the secret police, and comment right now. Do you believe prisons can exist under the ocean? Because by the end of this episode, you might wish you never asked. Welcome back. Tonight, we're not talking about a normal prison. Not a concrete block with barbed wire. Not a gulag in the snow. Tonight is about the people who disappeared so completely that their families never even got a body. No funeral. No grave. No explanation. Just one word. Relocated. And the terrifying part? That word wasn't an answer. It was a warning. The first time anyone realized something was wrong, it wasn't because a prisoner escaped. It wasn't because a guard talked. It wasn't because a journalist uncovered a scandal. It was because of a sound. A deep, metallic sound that traveled through water like a scream. It happened in the late 1980s, on a frozen stretch of coastline near the Barents Sea, where the Soviet Union kept its military secrets behind fences, checkpoints, and silence. A fisherman named Viktor Stepanov had been out on the water early, the way men in that region always were. The sea was his job, his religion, and his only reliable source of money. The Soviet economy was collapsing. People were hungry. Viktor didn't have the luxury of fear. But that morning, fear found him anyway. The sea was calm. Too calm. The sky was low and gray, like the world had been wrapped in a wet blanket. His boat drifted near a restricted zone, one of those invisible lines everyone knew not to cross. Then Viktor heard it. A slow, heavy pounding. Not like waves. Not like ice. Not like a ship. This was different. This sounded like something trapped. Viktor leaned over the side of his boat, staring into black water that looked thick enough to swallow light. The pounding came again. And then again. 3 hits. The pause. Then 2. A pattern. A message. His stomach tightened. Because Viktor had served in the Navy years earlier, and he recognized what it sounded like. A distress code. Something was down there. And it was alive. He didn't radio it in. That would have been suicide. You didn't call Soviet authorities and tell them you'd heard something inside a restricted naval zone. That was how people disappeared. Instead, Viktor did what most people did in the Soviet Union when they saw something they weren't supposed to. He went home. He kept his mouth shut. And he tried to forget. But he couldn't. Because that night when he returned to shore, he saw the trucks. Black military trucks. No markings. No headlights. Just silhouettes moving along the coastal road, one after another, like a funeral procession without mourners. And behind them, something even worse. A long, low-platform trailer, carrying a steel structure covered in tarps. It looked like a section of a submarine. Or a door. Or a cage. Viktor stood in the cold, watching, while his hands shook so badly he couldn't even light a cigarette. Then, as the last truck passed, one soldier turned his head and looked directly at Viktor. It wasn't a curious look. It wasn't a warning. It was the look of a man who already knew Viktor didn't matter. Like he was already dead. Viktor never spoke about what he saw for years. But in 1992, after the Soviet Union collapsed and people started whispering about old secrets, Viktor finally told a journalist something that still makes investigators go cold. I heard knocking from under the sea. And he believed it was coming from a prison. At the same time, hundreds of miles away, a woman named Elena Markova was staring at a different kind of silence. The silence of a missing son. Elena lived in Leningrad, in a cramped apartment that smelled like boiled cabbage and cigarette smoke. Her son, Yuri Markov, was a physics student, brilliant, stubborn, and dangerously honest. Yuri wasn't a criminal. Not in the way people think. He didn't rob banks. He didn't kill anyone. His crime was writing. He'd been part of a small group that distributed banned literature, copying pages by hand, passing them like contraband between friends. And one day, Yuri made the mistake that ruined his life. He wrote a letter criticizing the Soviet government, calling the prison system a machine designed to erase humans. He didn't send it to a newspaper. He didn't publish it. He wrote it to a friend. And the KGB still got it. They arrested Yuri in 1983. At first, Elena thought it would be like other political arrests. A show trial. A sentence. A labor camp. Horrible, yes, but at least she would know where he was. At least she could send food packages. At least she could write letters, even if they were censored. At least she could hope. But that isn't what happened. Yuri was held for 2 months. Then, one day, Elena received a short official notice. It said Yuri had been transferred. No location. No prison number. No reason. Just one word. Relocated. Elena went to the local prison office, demanding answers. They treated her like she was nothing. She went to the courthouse. They told her to go home. She wrote letters to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. No reply. She wrote letters to Moscow. No reply. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2. And Elena started hearing rumors from other families. Whispers in bread lines. Murmured conversations in stairwells. Stories of sons, husbands, and brothers who were relocated and never seen again. Not executed. Not released. Just removed. Like they'd been deleted. And here's where the story becomes terrifying. This wasn't happening to one family. It wasn't happening to 10. It was happening to hundreds. Especially to political prisoners, dissidents, and men who knew too much. Engineers, journalists, naval officers, scientists. People who could speak. People who could expose. People who could embarrass the state. And the state didn't just want them imprisoned. The state wanted them erased. In the late Soviet period, the prison system was massive. But it was also messy. Paper trails existed. Records existed. Even the KGB had bureaucracy. So when someone disappeared completely, it wasn't an accident. It was a design. And for years, investigators believed the answer was simple. Secret executions. Mass graves. Bodies dumped in forests. But then a former naval archivist came forward with something that cracked the entire theory open. His name was Sergei Antonov. He wasn't a dissident. He wasn't a hero. He was the kind of man who had spent his life keeping his head down, doing his job, and surviving. In 1994, Sergei was unemployed, broke, and drinking too much. The Soviet Union was gone, and men like him, men who knew secrets, were suddenly liabilities. So Sergei made a decision. He sold a copy of a naval logistics ledger to a Western researcher. A ledger that, on the surface, looked boring. Just numbers. Coordinates. Fuel records. Transport schedules. But hidden inside the mundane details was a pattern. A pattern that didn't belong. The ledger showed repeated trips by naval transport vessels to coordinates that didn't match any known base. Not oil platforms. Not shipping lanes. Not military harbors. Just open water. And the shipments weren't normal. They weren't weapons. They weren't food. They were labeled with coded inventory terms that didn't make sense. Unit transfers. Special cargo. Medical containment. Facility support. And then there was one phrase that appeared again and again in the margins. Written in pencil, not ink. As if someone didn't want it official. K-Project. Sergei didn't know what K-Project meant. But he knew one thing. Those shipments increased dramatically in the exact years when political prisoner disappearances spiked. And when the researcher compared those dates to lists of missing prisoners, the overlap was too perfect to ignore. It was like 2 separate worlds, prisons and naval operations, were secretly connected. At first, Western analysts dismissed it. They said it was paranoia. Cold War conspiracy. A story too cinematic to be true. An underwater prison? That sounded like science fiction. But then, in 1998, something happened that made even skeptics stop laughing. A declassified Soviet naval engineering file surfaced. Not the whole thing. Just fragments. But one page contained a diagram. A diagram of a submerged structure. It wasn't a submarine. It wasn't a torpedo. It was a modular facility, designed to be anchored underwater, with airlocks, pressure chambers, emergency oxygen reserves, and an internal layout that looked disturbingly familiar. Cells, corridors, a central control hub. The document didn't call it a prison. It used a euphemism, long-term containment module. And beneath that, a phrase that made the researcher who found it physically nauseous. Human occupancy, 200 units. Not 200 people. 200 units. Like cargo. Like equipment. Like disposable objects. Now, here's the part that makes this story more than speculation. Because once that diagram appeared, investigators started revisiting old testimony. Old rumors. Old deaths. And suddenly, details that seemed meaningless before started forming a horrifying picture. Like the story of a former prison guard who fled to Finland in 1991. He claimed that in his final months of service, he was ordered to escort prisoners to a military airfield. Not to another prison. Not to a camp. To a military airfield. The prisoners were blindfolded. Their hands were bound. And each one was given a medical injection before boarding. The guard said the prisoners didn't resist. Not because they were compliant, but because they were too weak to fight. He remembered one prisoner in particular, a man in his 40s, thin, shaking, whispering something under his breath. The guard leaned in, thinking he was praying. But the prisoner wasn't praying. He was repeating a sentence over and over, like it was the only thing keeping him sane. They're taking us to the water. They're taking us to the water. Elena Markova never saw her son again. But in 2001, she received something in the mail that made her collapse onto her kitchen floor. No return address. No note. Just a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. Grainy. Black and white. It showed a group of men standing in a narrow corridor. They were shirtless. Their heads were shaved. Their faces looked hollow. And behind them, bolted to the wall, was a sign in Russian. Most of it was unreadable. But one word was clear. Decompression. Elena stared at it for hours, her fingers trembling as she traced the letters like she could pull the truth out of the paper. Because decompression wasn't something you saw in normal prisons. Decompression was something you saw in submarines. In underwater facilities. In places where the pressure could kill you if you tried to escape. And on the far left of the photograph, half out of frame, Elena saw a face she recognized instantly. You're older. Thinner. But unmistakably her son. Her knees gave out. And in that moment, Elena realized something that no mother should ever have to realize. Her son hadn't been executed. He hadn't been freed. He hadn't been sent to a camp. He had been buried alive. Under the ocean. By the early 2000s, investigators had built a theory so horrifying it sounded impossible. That during the late Soviet period, certain political prisoners were transferred to submerged containment facilities, naval installations hidden offshore, where they could be held indefinitely, without oversight, without paperwork, and without any chance of rescue. A prison you couldn't break out of. Because even if you escaped your cell, you'd still be underwater. And if you reached the surface, there would be nowhere to go. Only cold sea. Only darkness. Only death. But the theory still needed one thing. Proof. Real proof. Not rumors. Not diagrams. Not anonymous photographs. Something physical. Something undeniable. And that proof almost surfaced in 2006, when a private salvage crew, searching for sunken Soviet equipment, found something on the seabed that wasn't supposed to exist. They found a sealed metal hatch. Bolted into a concrete platform. And etched into the steel, barely visible under decades of salt and corrosion, was a number. A facility designation. K-129. The same code that appeared again and again in Sergei Antonov's naval ledger. The salvage crew reported it. They took pictures. They marked coordinates. And then, within 48 hours, their ship was boarded by armed men. Not police. Not Coast Guard. Men in unmarked uniforms. The crew was detained. Their cameras were confiscated. Their navigation logs were seized. And they were told, in no uncertain terms, that if they spoke about what they saw, they would disappear like the others. But one of the crew members, terrified and furious, managed to hide a single image. One image. A close-up of the hatch. And on it, painted in faded Soviet stenciling, were two words in Russian. Two words that, once translated, made every investigator's blood run cold. Because they didn't say restricted. They didn't say naval. They didn't say danger. Containment cells. And that is where this ends. Because in the next one, we're going to follow those coordinates, uncover what K-129 really was, and expose the name of the man who designed the system. And when you hear what happened to the prisoners inside, you'll understand why the Soviet government didn't just hide this place. They tried to erase it from history. The coordinates. If you're still watching right now, you're officially part of the 1% that doesn't flinch when the story gets real. So do me a favor. Hit like if you want the full truth, subscribe if you don't want to miss what the Soviet files tried to bury, and comment this, open the hatch. Because what we're about to uncover is the kind of evidence that makes people vanish. The coordinates from the salvage crew weren't random. They weren't somewhere in the ocean. They were specific, deliberate, and when investigators plotted them on a map, the location sat like a tumor in the sea, just far enough from the mainland to be unreachable by civilians, and just close enough to be supported by naval supply routes. It was the perfect place to hide something that was never supposed to exist. A place where sound dies, where light doesn't reach, where a scream becomes a vibration, and a vibration becomes nothing. The man who first tried to chase those coordinates wasn't a spy or a soldier. He was a researcher, a quiet, obsessive historian named Daniel Rourke, an American who had spent his life studying Soviet penal systems, and who had become convinced that the relocation notices weren't bureaucratic laziness. They were code. Daniel wasn't reckless. He didn't believe in conspiracy for entertainment. He believed in patterns. And he had a pattern in front of him that made his hands shake every time he opened his notes. Because the disappearances weren't spread evenly across the Soviet Union. They clustered, and those clusters aligned with naval infrastructure. Not prisons. Not courts. Not labor camps. Navy. When Daniel received the leaked photograph of the hatch, K-129, and saw the stenciled words, containment cells, he knew he had crossed into a level of truth that could get him killed. But he also knew something else. If this was real, it wasn't just a story. It was one of the greatest hidden crimes of the 20th century. And crimes like that don't stay hidden forever. They leak. They corrode. They surface. Daniel's first mistake was thinking that the Soviet collapse meant Soviet secrets were dead. They weren't. The uniforms changed. The flags changed. The names changed. But the people who protected those secrets? They stayed. They simply learned to operate in a new world. A world where threats were quieter. Where a person didn't get arrested in the street. They just stopped answering their phone. Stopped showing up to meetings. Stopped existing. Daniel knew this. And he still flew to northern Russia in the winter of 2007, armed with nothing but a laptop, a translator, and a folder of documents that could make the wrong man panic. His translator was a woman named Irina Volkova. Early 30s. Cautious. The kind of person who watched doorways and windows even in cafes. Irina had grown up in Murmansk, the naval city that sat like a steel scar on the edge of the Arctic. Her father had been a submarine mechanic. When Daniel told her what he was investigating, she didn't laugh. She didn't argue. She didn't even look surprised. She only asked one question. "Do you want the truth?" she said, "or do you want to survive?" Daniel told her the same thing he'd told himself for years. If it's real, people deserve to know. Irina stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Then don't trust anyone," she said. "Not even me." The first person they met was a former naval diver. His name was Mikhail Sokolov. He lived in a crumbling apartment block outside Murmansk, in a building that smelled like wet concrete and old cooking oil. He had the look of a man who had spent too much time underwater. Pale skin, eyes that seemed permanently tired, hands that twitched slightly like they still felt pressure changes. Mikhail was drunk when they arrived. Not the sloppy kind of drunk. The careful kind. The kind of drunk you maintain to keep nightmares from getting too loud. Daniel slid a photo across the table. The hatch. K-129. Mikhail stared at it. Then he leaned back and exhaled. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said. Irina translated, but her voice had changed. It was quieter now. Daniel asked the question anyway. "Have you ever seen something like this?" Mikhail didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, walked to his window, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look down at the street. Then he came back and sat. Yes, he said. Irina's throat tightened when she translated that one. Daniel leaned forward. Mikhail tapped the photo with his finger. This, he said, is not a hatch to a submarine. Daniel's heart pounded. What is it? Mikhail's eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as if he was trying to remember something he had spent years forcing himself to forget. It's a door, he said. A door to a place where they kept people. Daniel's mouth went dry. Mikhail continued, his voice steady now, as if the words had been waiting in him like poison. In 1986, he said, I was part of a special diving unit. We were told we were servicing an underwater research module. That's what they called it. Research module. Another euphemism. Another lie. Mikhail swallowed hard. They made us sign papers, he said. Not normal papers. Papers that said if we spoke, our families would suffer. Daniel asked, where was the module? Mikhail hesitated. Then he reached under his table and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. A medal. A Soviet military medal, tarnished and scratched. On the back was an engraving, a date, and a code. Daniel stared at it, feeling the air in the room change. Mikhail pointed to the code. This is how they paid us, he said. Not with money. With silence. Mikhail told them the module sat on a concrete base on the seabed, connected to the surface by supply lines and access tubes. It wasn't huge like a city. It was efficient. Built like a machine. He said there were two ways in. One was a vertical access shaft that connected to a disguised platform above. The other was a docking port designed for mini-submersibles. But what made Daniel's stomach twist was the next detail. Mikhail said the module wasn't meant for long-term comfort. It was meant for long-term control. Inside were rows of narrow cells with metal doors, each with a small circular window like the porthole of a ship. The prisoners were kept under constant artificial lighting, never full darkness, never full day. Just enough light to break the mind. Food came through a slot. Water was rationed. Air was filtered. And the walls were thick. Not to keep prisoners in. To keep sound out. Because sound travels in water. And if a fisherman heard screaming, if a diver heard banging, if a sonar operator heard patterns that didn't match the sea, questions would begin. So they built it like a tomb. A functioning tomb. Daniel asked the obvious question. How did they get prisoners there? Mikhail's jaw tightened. By plane, he said. To a naval airfield. Then by truck. Then by boat. Daniel froze. That matched the testimony from the prison guard who had fled to Finland. Irina's hands shook slightly as she translated. Mikhail looked at her and said something that didn't need translating. He said her name. Irina's eyes widened. Daniel turned sharply. What did he say? Irina hesitated. Then she swallowed. He said, he knew my father. The room went colder. Daniel looked at Mikhail. Mikhail nodded once. Your father worked on the surface platform, he said to Irina. He didn't tell you because he wanted you to live. Irina's face went pale, like the blood had been drained from it. Daniel felt a sick realization settle in. This wasn't just history. This wasn't just archives. This was personal. It was alive. And it was still dangerous. Daniel wanted more proof. He asked Mikhail for coordinates. Mikhail laughed, one sharp, bitter sound. You think I wrote them down? He said. You think I wanted to remember? Daniel pressed him anyway. Mikhail stared at him with an expression that looked almost like pity. Then he leaned in and lowered his voice. There was a time, he said, when one of the modules malfunctioned. Daniel's heart hammered. What happened? Mikhail's eyes flicked again toward the window. Pressure, he said. Crack. A leak. Daniel asked, did anyone die? Mikhail's face tightened. No, he said. Not at first. Daniel waited. Mikhail's voice dropped even lower. They sealed the section, he said. They sealed it with people inside. Daniel's stomach turned. Irina's translation came out as a whisper. They sealed it, she repeated, with prisoners inside. Daniel felt his hands go numb. Why? He asked. Mikhail's eyes hardened. Because if they opened it, he said, the whole facility would be exposed. They would have to evacuate. They would have to admit it existed. He leaned back. So they did what they always did, he said. They made the problem disappear. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, this can't be real, I want you to pause for a second. Because this is where the story stops being rumor and starts becoming evidence. Daniel and Irina didn't leave Murmansk after meeting Mikhail. They stayed. And they made their second mistake. They started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. They visited a naval cemetery. They searched for K-project references. They looked for divers, engineers, mechanics. And every time they got close, something strange happened. Doors shut. Phones went dead. Appointments were cancelled. And the people they had spoken to suddenly didn't remember them. One man, a former logistics officer, met Daniel in a cafe and refused to speak above a whisper. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Daniel opened it. Inside were 4 numbers. Not coordinates. Not a name. 4 numbers. 1989. Daniel looked up. What is this? The officer's eyes were wide with fear. The year, he whispered, they moved the high-value prisoners. Daniel asked, where? The officer shook his head. I don't know, he said. I only saw the orders. Daniel asked, who signed them? The officer hesitated. Then he said a name that made Irina's face go blank. A name she recognized instantly. Because it was a name her father had warned her about when she was a child. A man in the Navy who wasn't Navy. A man who didn't wear a KGB badge, but everyone knew what he was. His name was Admiral Viktor Malenkov. And according to the officer, Malenkov wasn't just aware of K-Project. He was the architect of its prisoner transfers. That night, Daniel and Irina returned to their hotel and found the door to their room slightly open. Not kicked in. Not broken. Just open. Daniel stepped inside first. The room looked normal. No overturned furniture. No missing items. But the air felt wrong. Like someone had been there recently. Irina walked in behind him and froze. On the bed was Daniel's folder. Open. All documents laid out neatly, as if someone had been reading them. And on top of the folder was a new photograph. A photograph Daniel had never seen before. It was color, modern, and it showed the ocean. A gray surface under a winter sky. And rising out of the water like a scar was a platform. A disguised naval platform. Industrial. And on the side, barely visible, was the marking. K-129. Daniel's throat tightened. Irina whispered, they know. Daniel stared at the photo. Then he noticed something else. In the bottom corner was a date stamp. 2 days ago. Meaning whoever took it was still there. And whoever placed it on the bed had been standing in this room. In silence. While Daniel and Irina were out chasing ghosts. Daniel's phone buzzed. A known number. He answered. For a second, there was only breathing. Then a man's voice, calm and flat, spoke in Russian. Irina translated as the man spoke. He said, stop. Daniel tightened his grip. The man continued. Irina's face turned pale. He says, you're asking about people who never came back, she whispered. And if you keep asking, you'll join them. Daniel's mouth went dry. The line went dead. If you're still watching right now, comment K-129, so I know you're locked in, because what happens next is the most dangerous part of this entire investigation. Daniel and Irina had proof now. Not enough to publish. Not enough to bring down anyone. But enough to confirm that the facility existed. And enough to confirm that someone, somewhere, was still protecting it. But Daniel made one final move that turned this from an investigation into a manhunt. He contacted a former Soviet engineer, one of the men rumored to have worked on underwater containment technology. A man whose name appeared in a declassified file fragment. A man who had disappeared from public life in the 1990s. A man who, according to whispers, was living under a different identity. Daniel didn't know if the engineer would talk. But he sent the message anyway. And the engineer replied with a single sentence. A sentence that felt like a door opening. said, I will meet you. But only if you understand one thing. Daniel wrote back, what? The reply came seconds later, and it ended with a chilling promise that made Irina physically step back from the laptop. The engineer wrote, the prison wasn't built to hold criminals. It was built to hold secrets. And then, beneath that, and some of the secrets are still alive. Comment, open the hatch, if you think K129 was real, because we're exposing who designed it. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because the next one will reveals the one name the Soviet Navy never wanted connected to these disappearances. Drop a like if you want the full documentary-style breakdown, because the evidence in this is the kind that gets people followed. Comment right now, do you believe it? Because the final twist in this video will change how you see the word relocated forever. The secret that breathed. If you made it to this last, you're not just watching a story anymore, you're finishing an investigation that people were threatened for trying to start. So before we open the final file, hit like if you want the truth with no filter, subscribe if you want more cases the world tried to erase, and comment, bring it to light, because what you're about to hear is the closest thing to a real-life horror story, without anything supernatural at all. And I'm warning you now. This chapter ends with a detail that still doesn't have an explanation. Daniel Rourke didn't sleep that night. Neither did Irina. They sat in the hotel room with the curtains closed, the lights dimmed, and the laptop open like it was a weapon. The engineer's message sat on the screen. The prison wasn't built to hold criminals. It was built to hold secrets. And some of the secrets are still alive. Daniel read it over and over, like repeating it would make it less insane. But it didn't. It only made it worse. Because if the engineer was telling the truth, then the underwater prison wasn't just a dumping ground for dissidents. It was a vault. A vault for living people. And the only reason you lock living people in a vault is because you can't afford to let them speak. They arranged the meeting for the next day, in a place that wasn't romantic, wasn't cinematic, and wasn't safe. A bus station cafe. The kind of place where nobody notices you because everyone is too busy trying to leave. Murmansk was gray and brutal that morning, the wind cutting through the streets like a knife. Daniel wore a heavy coat, but the cold wasn't what made him shake. It was the feeling that they were being watched. Irina insisted they take separate taxis, arriving minutes apart. When Daniel walked into the cafe, he scanned the room. Old men drinking tea. A woman feeding a toddler. 2 soldiers in cheap uniforms. And one man in the far corner, sitting perfectly still, with his back against the wall. He didn't look like an engineer. He looked like a man who had spent his life learning how to survive. Gray hair, trimmed short. A clean coat. Hands folded on the table. Eyes that didn't move unless they had to. Daniel approached. The man didn't stand. He simply looked up and said, in English that was slow but clear, "You are late." Daniel sat. Irina arrived moments later and took the seat beside him. The man's eyes flicked to her. Then back to Daniel. "You should not have come," he said. Daniel swallowed. "Are you the one who messaged me?" The man nodded once. "My name is not important," he said. "Not anymore." Daniel leaned forward. "It's important to the people who disappeared." The man's face didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly around his cup. "You want to know about K129, he said. "NK project." Daniel said, "Yes." The man exhaled slowly. Then he said something that made Irina's skin go pale. K129 was not the only facility. Daniel felt his throat close. "How many were there?" The man's eyes drifted toward the cafe window, as if he could see the ocean from here. "More than one," he said. "Less than 10. Daniel's stomach dropped. That meant this wasn't an experiment. This wasn't a rumor. This was a program. A system. A network. Irina whispered, "My father?" The man looked at her for the first time with something close to sadness. "Your father worked on the surface platform," he said. "He was not a monster. He was a mechanic. But he was part of it." Irina's lips trembled. Daniel's voice tightened. "Who built it?" The engineer's eyes sharpened. "You already know the name," he said. Daniel swallowed. "Admiral Viktor Malenkov." The engineer didn't confirm it with words. He confirmed it by not denying it. And that silence was louder than any confession. Daniel pulled out the photo of the hatch. The engineer glanced at it, then pushed it back across the table like it burned. That door, he said, was designed to never open from the inside. Daniel asked, why? The engineer's answer came immediately. Because they did not want prisoners to escape, he said. And they did not want rescuers to enter. Daniel's hands clenched. So it was a death sentence. The engineer shook his head slowly. No, he said. A death sentence is quick. This was storage. Storage. That word hit Daniel like a punch. Irina's eyes filled with anger. You're talking about human beings, she said in Russian. The engineer didn't flinch. I know, he replied. That is why I am here. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. They chose prisoners who were difficult to kill, he said. Daniel blinked. What does that mean? The engineer's eyes locked on Daniel's. It means they chose prisoners whose deaths would raise questions, he said. Scientists. Naval officers. Foreign contacts. Dissidents with supporters. Men with families who would not stop asking. Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine. So instead of killing them, the engineer nodded. They buried them, he said, where no one could dig. The engineer's name, Daniel eventually learned, was Anatoly Kirov. Not his real name, but the only name he would allow. Anatoly had been a structural engineer attached to naval projects in the 1970s and 1980s. He didn't design torture devices. He didn't build weapons. He built pressure-resistant modules, underwater habitats, containment structures. And one day, he was called into an office and shown a blueprint. Not for a submarine. Not for a research station. For something else. A containment module. With cells. An airlock system. Decompression chambers. And an internal layout built around one idea. No escape. No communication. No witnesses. Anatoly told Daniel he protested. He said he asked what it was for. And the officer overseeing the project, an older man with cold eyes, smiled. This is not for criminals, the officer said. This is for the future. The future. That was how they justified it. As if human lives were just material. Raw resources. Anatoly said the officer told him something he would never forget. You cannot build a perfect prison on land, the officer said. There are too many eyes. But the sea. The officer paused, savoring the words. The sea keeps secrets. Daniel asked the question that had been haunting him since beginning. Were people really held there? Anatoly stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Yes, he said. Irina's hands clenched into fists. How do you know? She demanded. Anatoly's voice dropped. Because I heard them, he said. Daniel's breath caught. Anatoly's eyes looked distant, as if he was back underwater. I was sent down during a maintenance cycle, he said. It was supposed to be empty. Anatoly's voice cracked slightly. Tell my wife I am still here. That sentence didn't just confirm the prison existed. It confirmed something worse. These prisoners weren't anonymous. They weren't faceless. They had names, lives, families. And they were still hoping. Still waiting. Still believing someone might come. Daniel felt sick. Irina wiped her face angrily, like she refused to be seen crying. Daniel asked the next question. How long did they keep them alive? Anatoly's answer was brutal. As long as the facility could support them, he said. Daniel blinked. What happens when it can't? Anatoly stared at his cup. When the filters fail, he said. When the oxygen system fails, they do not fix it. Daniel felt his stomach twist. They let them die. Anatoly nodded. But not all at once, he said. Daniel's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Anatoly's voice dropped to almost nothing. Sometimes, he said, they moved the strongest prisoners to another module. And they sealed the rest. Daniel's mind flashed to Mikhail's testimony. A cracked section. A leak. A sealed compartment with people inside. This was the same story. From two different men. In two different places. With the same details. It wasn't a myth. It was procedure. Daniel asked Anatoly the question no one wanted to ask. Why did they do it? Anatoly's face hardened. Because the Soviet Union was afraid, he said. Daniel frowned. Afraid of what? Anatoly's eyes sharpened. Afraid of collapse, he said. Afraid of leaks. Afraid of humiliation. Afraid of the West. Afraid of their own people. He leaned in closer. And most of all, he said, afraid of the men who knew what was hidden beneath the sea. Daniel's mind raced. Like what? Anatoly didn't answer immediately. He looked at Irina. Then back to Daniel. And he said, the prisoners were not just dissidents. Daniel's chest tightened. Then who were they? Anatoly's voice turned colder. They were witnesses, he said. Witnesses to accidents. Witnesses to sabotage. Witnesses to crimes inside the Navy. Daniel stared. You're saying they locked people underwater because they saw something? Anatoly nodded. Yes, he said. And because they were alive, they were dangerous. Then Anatoly said something that changed everything. He said the K-Project modules were built during the same period as several mysterious Soviet naval disasters. Disasters where official explanations never made sense. Submarines lost with no clear cause. Explosions blamed on mechanical failure. Ships that vanished. And crews that were never recovered. Anatoly claimed that some prisoners were survivors. Survivors who had seen what really happened. Men who had been pulled from the sea after accidents that were supposed to leave no witnesses. Men who had overheard orders. Men who had seen the wrong cargo loaded. Men who had seen the wrong people meeting on decks at night. Men who knew the Navy wasn't just hiding technology. It was hiding crimes. Daniel asked, do you have proof? Anatoly reached into his coat slowly. Irina tensed instantly. But Anatoly didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a cassette tape. With a handwritten label in Russian. Daniel stared. What is that? Anatoly placed it on the table like it weighed 1,000 pounds. A recording, he said. Daniel's mouth went dry. Of what? Anatoly's eyes met his. Of inside the module, he said. Daniel's heart slammed. Irina's breath hitched. Anatoly leaned forward. One night, he said, I stole a small audio device from the engineering bay. I turned it on. And I left it near the corridor. Daniel stared at the tape. Why? Anatoly's voice tightened. Because I wanted proof, he said. And because I wanted to punish myself. Daniel swallowed hard. What's on it? Anatoly's answer was quiet. Knocking, he said. Whispers. And a man praying. Daniel's hands hovered over the tape. He didn't touch it yet. Because suddenly the cafe didn't feel safe. Daniel's eyes scanned the room. The soldiers. The old men. The woman with the toddler. Then he noticed something. One of the soldiers wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking. He was watching. Not casually. Not bored. Watching like a camera. Daniel's pulse spiked. Irina saw it too. Anatoly's eyes flicked toward the soldier. Then back to Daniel. His voice dropped. They found us, he said. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Irina whispered, we need to leave. Anatoly slid the tape across the table. Take it, he said. Daniel hesitated. What about you? Anatoly's face was calm. Too calm. Like a man who had already accepted his ending. They will not chase you, he said. Not yet. Daniel grabbed the tape and stood. Irina stood with him. The soldier rose instantly. So did the other one. Daniel's mind screamed. But they didn't run. Not yet. Running in a crowded cafe makes you a target. They walked quickly toward the exit. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The soldier followed. Daniel and Irina pushed through the door and stepped into the freezing air. The street was packed with people. Cars. Buses. Noise. But the feeling of being hunted was louder than all of it. Irina grabbed Daniel's sleeve. Taxi, she hissed. A car pulled up. Daniel shoved the door open. They jumped in. Irina slammed it shut. The taxi lurched forward. Daniel looked back. The soldiers were standing in the doorway of the cafe, watching them leave. Not running. Not panicking. Just watching. Like they didn't need to hurry. Like they already knew where Daniel was going. Back in the hotel room, Daniel locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. Irina sat on the bed, pale and shaking. Daniel stared at the cassette tape. This was it. This was the thing that could end the argument forever. Either it was real, or it was a trap. Daniel found an old tape player in a pawn shop earlier that week, just in case. He plugged it in. His hands trembled as he inserted the cassette. Irina whispered, "If this is real." Daniel pressed play. At first, there was static. Then a low hum. Like machinery. Like ventilation. A sound. Faint. Rhythmic. Metal against metal. Knocking. 3 hits. The pause. 2 hits. The exact pattern Viktor Stepanov had described decades earlier. Daniel's skin prickled. Irina covered her mouth. The knocking continued. Then, beneath it, something, and the whispers stopped instantly. Not because they were finished. Because they were afraid. Daniel's hands shook violently. Irina sobbed silently. Then, suddenly, the tape ended. Daniel sat back, breathing hard. There was no doubt now. No theory. No rumor. No maybe. It was real. Daniel knew he had to leave Russia immediately. He contacted the Western researcher who had funded parts of his trip. He sent a coded message. He packed his bag. Irina packed hers. They planned to leave at dawn. But that night, at 2:17 a.m., someone knocked on their hotel door. 3 hits. The pause. 2 hits. The same distress pattern. Daniel froze. Irina's eyes widened. The knocking came again. 3. Daniel's blood ran cold. Because that wasn't the pattern of a soldier. It wasn't the pattern of a threat. It was the pattern of a prisoner. A message. A warning. Irina whispered, "That's impossible." Daniel stared at the door. The knocking stopped. Then, under the door, something slid across the carpet. A photograph. Daniel bent slowly and picked it up. It was a color photo. Modern. Taken recently. It showed a man standing on a naval platform, bundled in winter gear. Behind him, the ocean. In front of him, the hatch. K-129. The man in the photo was holding something. A sign. A handwritten sign. In English. You open eye, they die. Daniel's hands went numb. Irina stared at the photo, her face drained of color. Daniel's phone buzzed. A known number. He answered. A calm voice spoke in Russian. Irina translated, trembling. He says. Her voice cracked. He says, "The prisoners are still alive." Daniel's throat tightened. The voice continued. Irina's eyes widened. He says, "Some of them have been alive for decades." Daniel's mind reeled. "How is that possible?" he whispered. The voice continued. Irina translated the final sentence, and it felt like the world tilted. He says. She says. Irina swallowed hard. He says, "One of them is Yuri Markov." Daniel felt his chest tighten violently. Elena's son. The student. The dissident. The face in the decompression photo. Still alive. After all these years. Daniel's hands shook. Irina whispered, "My God." The line went dead. Daniel and Irina didn't leave at dawn. Because by morning, Anatoly Kirov was missing. Gone. No trace. No body. No arrest record. Just erased. Like the prisoners. Daniel realized something then. This wasn't just about exposing history. This was about a living crime. A crime still being protected. And now Daniel had something that could destroy it. But he also had something else. A moral trap. Because the message was clear. If Daniel exposed the location, if he forced authorities to storm the hatch, if he turned K-129 into an international scandal, the people inside might be killed before anyone reached them. Daniel was staring at the tape when Irina spoke. "We can't just post it online," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "We need a plan." Irina's voice shook. "And we need to survive." Daniel made one last decision. He duplicated the tape. 3 copies. He mailed one to a journalist in London. one to a human rights group in Germany, and one to Elena Markova, the mother who had spent decades waiting. Then Daniel and Irina left Murmansk under false names, taking a train south, then crossing into Finland. And for a moment, it seemed like they had escaped, until Daniel noticed something on the train. A man, 2 rows behind them, reading a newspaper, never turning a page, watching their reflection in the window. Daniel's stomach dropped. Irina whispered, "They followed us." Daniel clenched his jaw. He didn't know if they'd make it out. But he knew something else. The tape was already out. The truth was already moving. And once truth moves, it becomes harder to stop. Months later, a journalist in London published an article, not naming K-129, not naming Malenkov, but hinting at an offshore Soviet containment program. The article went viral in certain circles. Human rights groups demanded investigations. Governments asked questions. And for the first time in decades, the sea started giving up its secrets. A NATO sonar operator came forward anonymously, claiming that in the late 1980s his team had detected unusual rhythmic signals near restricted Soviet waters. Signals that were dismissed at the time as mechanical noise. But when he listened again, he recognized the pattern. 3 hits, 2 hits, a distress code, a human message. Then, in 2009, something happened that no one could explain. A small Russian fishing boat near the Barents Sea reported hearing banging beneath their hull. The fishermen thought it was ice, until the banging formed a pattern. 3 hits, 2 hits. They reported it. The report was buried. But one fisherman recorded it on his phone. And that recording leaked online for a few hours before being removed. But people who heard it said the same thing. It sounded like someone knocking from inside a coffin. Elena Markova received her tape in the mail in 2008. She listened to it once. Then she listened again. Then she collapsed. Because among the whispers, she heard a voice that sounded like Yuri. Older. Broken. But alive. And Elena did what she had done for decades. She wrote letters. To governments. To journalists. To human rights groups. And this time, people answered. Not because they cared about one mother, but because now there was proof. Now there was sound. Now there was a story the world couldn't ignore. Admiral Viktor Malenkov died in 2010. Officially. A heart attack. Private funeral. No press. No public statements. But a former aide later claimed Malenkov didn't die peacefully. He died terrified. Because in his final weeks, he reportedly told someone close to him, "They're still knocking." And that is where this story ends. Not with a rescue. Not with justice. Not with a courtroom. But with a truth that is worse than a clean ending. Because if K-129 existed, if even one prisoner survived, then somewhere beneath the ocean, there may still be a door that was never meant to open. A door behind which someone is still alive. Still counting days. Still whispering names. Still knocking. 3 hits. 2 hits. And waiting for the surface. Comment, "They're still knocking," if you believe K